Hello and welcome to Behind the Headlights, Speed Channel's groundbreaking documentary series that tells the stories of some very special automobiles. These vehicles are so unique that they changed history and impacted the moods and attitudes of generations. I'm Bob Varsha, and I'll be your host as each episode of Behind the Headlights examines one extraordinary car. In this program, we focus on one of the meanest junkyard dogs of them all, Max Balchowsky's Old Yeller 2. This is the story of the American dream of becoming a champion, of Max and Ina Balchowsky and their little yellow car that could. It's a story of inspiration and ingenuity, as the Balchowskys' home-built Old Yeller 2 took on some of the most beautiful, expensive, and sophisticated sports cars of their day and gave quite the performance in the process. In the late 1950s, Old Yeller 2 attracted so much attention that literally tens of thousands of people would go to the races just to catch a glimpse of this mangy American junkyard dog of a car running against the pure-blooded European thoroughbreds. Southern California was the mecca for this so-called clash of cultures, and Max Balchowsky was more than happy to play the role of the underdog, stirring the pot and changing the rules and traditions of sports car racing forever. They were called the Fabulous 50s, with good reason. Television had reached into almost 90% of American households. The broad interstate highways were weaving their tentacles throughout Southern California, especially in Los Angeles. And hot rock and roll battled cool jazz to be America's favorite musical pastime.
The British Revolution had not yet taken place. Rock and roll was more primitive, Jerry Lee Lewis kind of rock and roll. It was still a time where people dressed up. It was still a time where people drank martinis.
The national mood was very upbeat. Fins were in, hemlines were rising, and everybody wanted to have fun. Prince Rainier married Grace Kelly. Marilyn Monroe married Arthur Miller. Don Larson pitched a perfect game in the World Series.
Perfect game in World Series history.
The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and the race to space was on. New York was growing up. Los Angeles was growing out, and the sprawl begat a trendy new car culture. Fast, home-built hot rods, sleek customs, and the new rage, finely tuned, expensive European sports cars helped define Southern California. Everyone in Hollywood was into fast and exotic iron.
This is where the hot rod industry started, back in the 30s with Wally Parks and Alex Zidius and Vic Edelbrock.
Sports car racing had just really come into vogue, especially in Southern California. And it attracted the glamorous people. It was written up not only in sports pages, but in the society pages.
Southern California was really the fountainhead for motor racing, because you had cam builders, manifold people, you had fabricators, you had everybody here.
We used to drag in the streets all the time. I mean, my first impression of California is the first thing, remember this, the stoplights were like this.
It was the best. The whole era. The racing, the wonderful friends.
I can't think of a more idyllic time to grow up if you loved cars than in Southern California, particularly Los Angeles in the 1950s.
GIs returning from Europe after World War II had discovered sports cars. Small, light, agile cars that could out-corner and out-brake anything from Detroit. With the exception of some Corvettes and a few Thunderbirds, American sports cars were just not competitive, it seemed, until the enterprising Southern California hot rodders decided to take on the European elite with their home-built specials.
World War II had a massive effect on automobile racing in the United States, because a lot of young men came home from the war with a massive exposure to machinery. They were restless, they had a little money in their pocket, and they wanted to go racing.
The ingenuity used to win wars was now being applied to win races. One of those mechanically skilled World War II vets was a clever kid from West Virginia named Max Balchowsky. Soon he would challenge the best sports cars Europe had to offer in a mangy-looking race car he built himself, and to everyone's shock, he'd win. Sports car enthusiasts and hot rodders still love to tell the remarkable story of Max Balchowsky and his legendary home-built race car. Cobbled together from discarded car parts with a rough-looking, crudely built body, faded yellow paint, and a noisy Buick Nailhead V8, Old Yeller looked like a junkyard dog on wheels, and Max was happy to have people believe that it was.
Max was really kind of a guy that just created an image of himself, and he loved the image.
He was this amazing guy who could take all these different pieces and put them together into something that was more than a sum of its parts.
He did everything that sports car purists believed you didn't do, and this thing was very quick.
Old Yeller was such a phenomenon. It was such a wonderfully nutty American-looking car. You instinctively loved it. It was the little guy out there against the big guys. It was great fun to watch it racing and see it do so well.
But Old Yeller's racing competitors, driving expensive, pedigreed, often factory-prepared Ferraris and Maseratis, discovered to their chagrin that Max and his beautiful, mechanically minded wife, Ina, had built a race-winning automobile with very little money.
He was just intrinsically a good mechanic, he and his wife, and they just, I mean, they raised hell with the best sports car racers in the country.
That it beat Maseratis and Ferraris just amazed me, knowing that they had built these things on their garage floor.
Yeah, I think we were all surprised by the performance of that old junkyard dog, because it would accelerate and just leave you standing there, and you just couldn't figure out how it could possibly do that, but it did it consistently.
How did the Balchowskys do it? What made Old Yeller so successful? And what was lurking under that crude sheet metal? It's time for the wraps to come off. In a moment, Behind the Headlights will take you back nearly half a century to meet Max and Ina Balchowsky as they lived the American dream, winning against all odds with their unforgettable upstart on wheels, the junkyard dog better known as Old Yeller 2.
There came along an old boy named Max Balchowsky that had come out here from West Virginia, and I ran into him first. He had these old yellow cars that he built on his garage floor in Hollywood there.
He had a little boy's mischievous thrill out of sort of confounding the experts.
It turns out that people found out over time, you know, this guy wasn't just some idiot that threw pieces together. He was actually really, really talented and could do things that nobody else could do at the time, or they didn't think of it at the time. And all this from a guy who didn't have any, like, official schooling.
What kind of guy was Max? I don't think anybody really knows for sure. He always complained about things, seemed to be negative, but he was still always willing to help and was bright. He knew what he was doing. But he wore coveralls. He was totally unpretentious.
He wanted to act like a tough guy all the time, but Max really wasn't tough.
Modest, clever, down to earth, inventive and gutsy, Max Balchowsky and his wife Ina made the perfect team.
They made a fabulous team. You could tell there was a great deal of love between the two of them.
She was a great, great lady, and Max and she got along famously.
Max and Ina were celebrity, and their show was they're building a car.
Max Balchowsky was born in 1924 in humble surroundings. He was a Lithuanian-American from a town called Fairmont in the coal mining mountains of north-central West Virginia. He grew up with his older brother Casper, but Max was one farm boy who didn't want to endure the rough rural life or become a miner.
When he was a kid, he loved working with bicycles, and he worked in a repair shop. He also worked in a watch shop. Somebody had taught him how to repair watches, and so from that point forward, he always loved to repair things and make things work.
When the war broke out, Max enlisted and served in one of the most dangerous positions as a ball turret gunner aboard a B-24 bomber. His bravery earned him an heroic combat record. In his squadron, he was known as a guy who could fix anything. After the war, Max migrated to the West Coast to join his brother Casper, better known as Bal. Naturally, Max became a mechanic. In Ina Marie Wilson, Max could not have found a more perfect partner.
Ina Wilson was a high school student, and her father had an automotive repair shop nearby, and she would walk in front of Bal's shop where Max was working. Certainly caught Max's eye, and it wasn't too long before Max won her over.
After a brief courtship, Max asked Ina to marry him. She was a good mechanic, and she had a head for business, which quickly became apparent when they opened their own shop, Hollywood Motors, specializing in enthusiast automobiles.
Well, the strongest thing in the Max Balchowsky organization was Ina.
She was the fabricator. She could weld, she could fabricate, and Max really relied on her as one of the primary mechanics in his shop.
Although she was knowledgeable enough of the psychological factors in the relationship to make Max think it was all his idea.
If anybody was more blunt than Max, it would have been Ina.
I remember if I'd get like a oil drop on the garage floor of the shop, I was in trouble. You don't spill nothing on the floor at the shop.
Max and Ina performed tune-ups, hop-ups, and engine transplants. For their day, they ran a very sophisticated shop. Max liked to say, "We can swap anything into anything."
They had a place that was called Hollywood Motors. It was like a shut-down gas station where they worked on these cars.
All the work was done at night. You could never go into Hollywood Motors like 9 o'clock in the morning like any other business. And so there were guys, me being one of them, which would hang around, and they would sometimes spend 40 minutes, Max would say 40 minutes, standing over the engine compartment, would say, like, just looking like that, you know? And you don't talk to them then.
Max and Ina never had children, but they adopted a big, lovable golden retriever named Ted. Ironically, when Max built the racing car that would immortalize him, it was named Old Yeller, after another dog made famous in the Walt Disney movie. Max, Ina, and their dog Ted soon became fixtures at all the sports car races, campaigning and winning in a faded, junky-looking yellow car that would soon become a legend.
We bought him at the pound in 1949, and there was such a natural dog, never taught him anything. That dog could do anything. In fact, he could do everything but drive the car. I could always tell how fast I was going when the dog was riding with me. He always rode outside, and right around 90 to 91 miles an hour, the air hitting his jaw and pulling it, so he'd come back in behind the windshield.
Max Balchowsky had the Speedbug, and he had it bad. In his shop, he studied, repaired, and improved upon sophisticated, expensive sports racing cars from England and Europe, and was convinced he could build a faster car using his own ingenuity, used parts, and very little money. But before the most infamous junkyard dog was sired, Max honed his skills in a channeled 32 Ford Roadster called the Buford Special, and he dropped a big Buick V8 into a British-built Swallow Doretti. Max proved he could make any car run faster.
I remember Balchowsky for the first time at Torrey Pines in '52, and he ran in those days a car that he called the Buford Special. When he got up to speed on the longer straightaways, it made this whistling noise through the radiator, so you could hear him going by, you know, or coming down on the back stretch.
Max road raced his 32 Ford and soon replaced its pre-war LaSalle flathead with a new souped-up overhead valve Buick Nailhead V8. He began to get serious about road racing, and his weapon of choice was a hot rod.
The car was really kind of fascinating. You know, it was the first hot rod and that actually ran in the sports car races. It really looked like a hot rod, you know, a big high boy. So there was a certain amount of resentment between the hot rod and the sports car camp.
One of Max's competitors was another builder of hot rod road racing specials, Dick Morganson, whose Morganson Special would come to play a key role in Max's racing career.
It was pretty rustic. It had a six-cylinder Plymouth 6 in it, 2 carburetors, and it was painted red, white, and blue.
The Morganson Special won a lot of races, and everyone wanted to drive it. Sadly, the first time that popular up-and-coming racer Margaret Pete Pritchard drove Dick Morganson's Special, she suffered a tragic accident.
There was an incident at Torrey Pines where Margaret Pritchard was in a ladies' race with the Morganson Special.
And she was unfamiliar with the car, and she was unfamiliar with the power.
And she rolled the car on the first turn. And I didn't actually see it roll, but you know, I saw them dragging it back, and we all heard, and she was killed in the car.
That really depressed Dick Morganson, so he called his friend Max Balchowsky and said, "Max, would you come and pick the car up and sell it on consignment?" And Max said he'd be glad to do that.
Looking for something faster than his '32 Ford, Max completely rebuilt the wrecked Morganson Special. Then Max installed one of his potent Buick V8s in the car and successfully co-drove it with Eric Hauser.
At that time, Old Yeller #1 had a very prominent reputation in the road racing industry. Eric Hauser in particular had won a number of road races, and Max Balchowsky was very successful in racing it also and maintaining the car.
The problem with it was that that the body work had been done by Morganson himself, you know, with a hammer and just bending sheets of aluminum around it, except for the rear deck, which was made out of parts of an old truck or something. Why, of course, Max capitalized on that.
Junkyard dog notwithstanding, Max broke the Santa Barbara track record in Old Yeller 1, which was formerly held by Lance Reventlo's High Dollar Scarab. That's when Max knew he could be competitive in sports car racing, using his brains, his intuitive mechanical skills, and very little money.
Max was a smart son of a gun, and he was a racer's racer. This guy was out there. He was a great driver.
Eric and Max drove the car quite successfully. Up until the time my brother got the car, it had 16 wins.
In 1959, Eric Hauser and Max parted ways. Hauser took the chassis of the car, and Max kept the Buick engine.
And so he built the new car, which I thought was uglier than the old one, although he did a much better job, Max did, of making the body on it. You know, it looked more professional.
Max would soon return in another homely race car, still home-built, but much faster and more sophisticated.
And the #2 car was very easy to work on. A 12-year-old kid could work on it. In fact, all of them were simple after that. Because if you're working on the car and then you have to build one, you want to make it easier for you to work on, if you can.
I think if we're going to talk about Max Balchowsky and the Old Yellers, these were cars, specials as they were called, that Max built, we have to go back to the situation that existed in Southern California at the time Max got started. The specialty car market was kind of divided into two parts. There were the hot rodders, and then there were the sports cars.
Unlike hot rods of the day, built by young guys, often in backyard garages, sports cars were more expensive and more exclusive.
Because most sports cars in those days came from England, the hot rodders deprecatingly referred to the sports car people as teabaggers. Now, the teabaggers had certain affectations. They liked to wear string-back driving gloves and silly little British caps, while the hot rodders, of course, liked to show their working-class origins with Levi's and white T-shirts.
Sports car people felt that the hot rodders were greasy fingernail backyard mechanics, and the hot rodders felt that these teabaggers were snobs and didn't know how to do anything themselves, so they had to go out and spend their money to buy fancy cars. And Max, of course, was in the middle of it because he had what was essentially a hot rod running in road racing.
Not everyone could afford a high-dollar, sophisticated imported sports car, so a few talented people built their own. The special phenomenon started before World War II with Briggs Cunningham and his Bumerc, an old Mercedes with a hopped-up Buick Straight 8. His pal Miles Collier's Ardent Alligator was a British Riley with a Ford flathead engine.
They'd buy little English cars and put big American engines in them. So I thought this was tremendous fun, and I admired these guys making the car themselves and using the parts, borrowing things, and sometimes making stuff work that wasn't supposed to work.
Special building progressed after the war to builders like Bill Murphy with his homemade creation called the Bumerf, holding a Buick V8. Ken Miles' MG specials, the R1 and R2, the clever Troutman and Barnes special that anticipated the Scarabs, and Dick Morganson's Plymouth-powered sports car, which became Old Yeller 1.
The hot rodders made cars that were incredibly fast. These were cars used every day by these kids to either go to high school or go to their jobs. These cars could run the standing quarter mile in under 15 seconds.
The hot rod technology is pretty straightforward, but some people do it very well and some people don't. In Max's case, he did it beautifully.
They had a race in Santa Barbara where the Ferraris came down, the Maseratis came down, all the Italian cars came down. And Max won that race with his old junkyard special. And the headlines back in Italy was Italians' best race cars beaten by a junkyard special.
It made for such great press, and also it created a fabulous thing for the spectators, because if they came out of the hot rod background, if they liked American cars, they could root for Max. If they came out of the background of thinking everything foreign was better and foreign cars were so super, they could root against Max. And it created tremendous interest in the public and really helped sports car racing to grow.
Purists argued, unsuccessfully, that these roughly constructed specials shouldn't be allowed to run with so-called thoroughbred race cars.
Anybody who thinks that the specials shouldn't have been allowed to run with the other cars is just blowing smoke, because to see Max Balchowsky out there in Old Yeller running against the best road racing drivers in the United States and the best cars available was just a hoot. Everybody loved it.
Sometimes under that crude sheet metal of those specials, there was some very sophisticated engineering. Max and Ina Balchowsky's Old Yeller was considered one of the best.
I didn't know the cars would ever be that good, or I'd have spent more money on them and went more races, you know. Everybody was bad-mouthing me so bad, that ugly female, don't let it on the track. And I ran into those cases. One guy come over to me once in '54 and he says, are you planning on running tomorrow? And I says, yeah, why? He says, not if those guys have anything to do with it. And I thought, what? If I qualify, I qualify.
Old Yeller 1, I believe, was Max's idea of fun. I think Old Yeller 2 was Max's idea of racing.
Max loved fooling people and downplaying his considerable mechanical skill and ingenuity. Confident of his abilities, he built his race car from supposedly discarded parts, or at least he made it look that way.
It may be true that he used old Coke signs on his Old Yeller 2 as he bent those around to make the fenders and the hood for the car. And it may be true, but underneath it was a well-built car.
When I drove it, why, I realized that from the standpoint of just appearance, it was deceiving, because the car was pretty doggone sophisticated.
He offered me a ride in that car at Santa Barbara, his wife did, and said, I want you to meet Max. So I went over there and took a look at that car, and I said, that's the ugliest car I ever saw. And I had my little MG Special, which was beautiful, and I said, I wouldn't drive that car. Biggest mistake of my life.
Max and Ina built Old Yeller 2 in just 7 weeks, and their strategy was very unique.
When I saw Max and Ina build a car, what was happening is there was nothing on the garage floor wall, and they would start putting chalk marks on. And then there'd be some tubes laid out.
And then she bent the tubing and they built the frame right there based on nothing more than chalk marks on the floor of the garage.
It was like a beautiful show, where there was no other place around where you could see such a thing.
He would go get good parts from the junkyard. Not junk, they weren't bad parts, if you follow me. They were good, strong stuff, and he knew that you could get. He'd use a Studebaker in because they had a big choice of differential gears. He used Ford stuff, Pontiac stuff.
He wanted to make sure that he could adjust the suspension and the geometry of the front end. So he used a Jaguar 120 upper A-arm, which he drilled, and the lower was a GM Pontiac, which he shortened 4 inches. And with that combination, he was able to set the suspension and adjust it for each track.
As long as it was cheap and it would fit in his plans, he could make it work, and for the most part, it would last.
He just built a car with a big engine and big brakes and hang on.
One trick I remember he used was he would drill holes in the suspension pieces, not to lighten them, but so the suspension pieces would collapse if he hit something, which he did, so the car's frame, all that stuff would be fine.
Another thing that Max figured out was street tires don't blow out on the racetrack till they wear out. And everybody thought that he was just being an eccentric nutcase when he put white sidewalls on these cars that he built. But he knew for a fact that they outstuck the racing tires and they gave them an advantage.
So here you have a car with a Buick engine and a Jaguar transmission and like Lincoln brake pieces and Ford. I just thought that part was all really cool, this mishmash of stuff.
It was just a combination of things that worked.
Max almost always test drove Old Yeller on the street, just as if he were driving at the track. He was friends with a lot of cops, and Old Yeller was a local favorite, so he hardly ever got into trouble.
He would take off at 4 o'clock in the morning or go around Hollywood streets and burn rubber, pick it up to, I don't know, 80 miles an hour.
I remember climbing into a small fiberglass bucket seat that he just sat in. It wasn't even bolted down. And I jumped in and sat down, and he said, hang on, and grabbed onto a water hose that was there and put my head down, and he took off down San Fernando Road. And when I finally got enough courage to lift my head and look at the speedometer, it was going past 170 miles an hour.
Max had found ways to coax impressive horsepower and meaty torque out of his modified Buick engines, and he made them reliable on the track.
Not only did it have all these unique appearances and break quite a few of the rules, it did compete with the Ferraris and the Maseratis and the Jaguars, and it did so very convincingly.
Then I was going for the April Grand Prix at Riverside, and Gurney come over, Dan Gurney, and we had a bite to eat. So I asked him what he was driving. He says, nothing, I don't have nothing. I says, well, you want to drive my car? And he said, don't you want to drive it? I said, yeah, but if you want to drive it, go ahead. I hate to see a big boy cry. So anyway, we went out and drove it around the street, and he couldn't believe it. And at that time, I'm thinking, something I missed. He'd been driving 4.9 Ferraris, and he thought my car was great. So it may not look great, but it drove nice.
Max Balchowsky came to California from rural West Virginia with his own ideas about class warfare. He succeeded in breaking down the inherent caste system that existed in road racing between the expensive imports and the home-built racers.
The Italian coach builders were building the breathtakingly beautiful aluminum-bodied Ferraris and Maseratis, and then you look at Old Yeller, this clapped-out old race car, and all the dented bodywork and kind of that gaping nose on it and the flapping fenders. I think that happily would have been ignored had it not gone so bloody fast.
These were big, expensive, they were technically sophisticated with overhead cam engines. And here was a car made of homemade parts, maybe junkyard parts, with big gummy white walls, and it was faster than they were. People were insulted.
The big teams had a superiority complex that was quickly cut down to size by Max and Ina and their rude, crude, but very fast sports car.
He always bragged about picking up pieces from the junkyard and the fact that he had a $2,000 car. He just loved rubbing that in when he could.
He might have been trying to snub the Europeans to some extent, trying to beat them at their own game with an ungainly mongrel of a car. He succeeded.
Most racing cars were not driven on the streets and usually didn't have license plates, but Max flaunted convention wherever he could. He drove Old Yeller on the street and kept the plates on even when he was racing.
That kind of stuff is just cool because it's sort of like saying to whoever's behind him, like, you're being beat by this car that's just like a street car. You're pathetic.
Another way Max loved to buck the system was working with his wife Ina as an equal partner. Women simply didn't work on cars in those days, especially in the pits. But Ina did.
Ina was very good. She'd set the timing, change the plugs, and she would call a new track, a track that they hadn't run at, then find out how many right-hand and left-hand turns, how long the straight was. And certainly this gentleman at the other end was wondering, what's this for? And Ina would reply, "I'm just setting up the chassis."
Ina maintained her feminine side very well, and yet she was also an excellent mechanic, probably right there with Max in terms of engineering. And she didn't expect any special privileges.
I was at Pomona when she did apparently tear a side pipe off a car that had gotten knocked. I don't know if Max hit a hay bale or whatever, but I didn't see her do it, but I heard firsthand reports minutes later where she just, I guess, grabbed some shop rags and just tore the thing off.
Buick V8s rarely saw a road racing circuit.
He did not choose the engine of choice of the hot rodders, which was the flathead Ford V8, but instead chose a Buick V8, out of which he got incredible performance.
It was a brilliant move because the Buick was superior to the Cadillacs and the Chevrolets and all the rest of the stuff for the very simple reason that it had small valves and you could rev the hell out of them.
He ended up getting very good performance out of an engine, which also surprised, quote, the experts, unquote, and so he had even more stir in the pot, so to speak.
Nobody knows for sure how much engineering assistance, if any, Buick provided. But it was rumored that Max was Buick's skunk works.
What I was able to find in some of my research was a shipping bill of lading of a couple Buick engines that were shipped out to Max at no charge.
Time and time again, there'd be at Hollywood Motors unmarked crates, wood crates, and it said industrial use only. And it was said General Motors, and it was a Buick motor. And I guess industrial use may mean for racing, I'm not sure.
There could have been a part of something that Buick was working on for a future engine that they would actually have him put in Old Yeller, and as a way of testing it will, so he was fulfilling a service for them.
Some of the no-charge invoices from Buick to Max survive today. They're labeled modification for sports cars, but Buick had none. What is certain is that Max's success with V8 engines spawned a lot of interest in comparatively large displacement American V8s in sports cars.
I was too stingy. I wouldn't spend money, you know. That's why I don't want to spend the $100 for a tire, so I didn't go to the races. You know, I could have run a lot more. When I look back at it, instead of running those stock motors, I should have run a little more expensive motors. And nobody believes I was running stock motors.
Max, Ina, and Old Yeller 2 were a familiar sight at the racetracks around Southern California, including the drag strips.
He told me this story over and over that many times he wanted to check gearing and acceleration only, and the only place he could do it is at a drag strip. And so he would go to San Fernando, and they just knew him. When the Old Yeller came, they would open the gates, and the announcer would say, "The Old Yeller 2 is here." And he would rip off a run. He would break the sports car racing category group record, and then he would drive home, and he accomplished what he wanted to do. But he left the trophies for the other people.
Max loved to drive, and he was fast. But if he could get a real hot shoe behind the wheel, he'd cheerfully give up his seat to some who would become the most famous drivers of all time. He was driven by the need to win.
Although the car looked kind of crude, it was probably the easiest road race car I ever drove.
You can't drive any car with total abandon, but you can get closer to some than with others, and Old Yeller was very good.
A lot of torque, so he didn't have to shift gears nearly as often. The brakes worked, and it was fast.
The most memorable race that I ever drove in Max's Old Yeller was at Elkhart Lake in 1960. It was a 200-mile race, and as I remember, it's $10,000 first prize. And I made a deal with Max where I got half of it if I won. I needed that money.
All the big names were there, and their Ferraris, their Maseratis, their Jaguars, all this stuff. And by God, if Shelby doesn't lead the race for a while.
Right from the get-go, Carroll jumped out into the lead and was cruising with a 51-second lead over the best competition in the world, which included the Le Mans Streamliner Maserati.
I led that race every foot of the way. I'm coming up the last lap, just as I turn the right-hand corner, start up the hill, boy, I was in third gear, snap, and I never made it up the hill.
Shell comes down the pit road very slowly after the transmission had broken. All the reporters are gathered around waiting to hear what Max is going to have to say.
And Max said, what happened? I said, I think we broke a main shaft in the gearbox. It won't go in any gear. Damn it, I gave $40 for that gearbox. You didn't have to break it on the last lap. I said, man, I needed that $5,000. I didn't break it on purpose, Max.
All these reporters are writing this stuff down as fast as they can, calling it into their editors. And this was the image Max created.
That's the way Max did things. He wouldn't anymore go buy a new transmission. He wouldn't anymore buy a new engine. He wouldn't buy a new part for anything. Everything came out of the junk pile, literally, although he liked to make a big deal and let people know that.
It was a joke, and Max wanted to keep it a joke.
Oh, Max, God bless him wherever he is, really did a great service to breaking down the barriers and the snobbery that did exist around European sporty cars.
Old Yeller's 1 and 2 were just the beginning. Max was relentless in continually improving his cars. When they became obsolete, he'd build another and another. But Old Yeller 2 would always be the car that he would be remembered for.
Making those independent front ends, I did a lot of foreign cars and converted and put my front ends and my differentials in them. I converted a lot of Maseratis, even some Ferraris. I put the first Chevy 4-speed trances in the Ferraris. So much cheaper. In fact, Bill Rudd come over and went, I want to drive that thing. And he'd been working on the Ferraris all the time. Bill's a good guy. And he said, well, I'll be damned. That Chevy really works good in there.
Old Yeller 2 was a phenomenon, and it enjoyed an incredible 2 years of crowd-thrilling success in 1959 and 60. But every dog has its day, and Max Balchowsky's Old Yeller 2 was no exception.
The technologies that were coming along were independent rear suspension, mid-engines, all kinds of things that car did not predict. That car harked back to a much earlier period in American car development.
The other guys were getting sophisticated. The other builders, foreign and domestic, were going to disc brakes, space frames, and the imported engines were bigger and better.
To keep up, Max built a series of Old Yeller cars. Renowned filmmaker Haskell Wexler was an unofficial sponsor of many of them.
I never kept track of which Old Yellers were really mine or not. I paid for the right to be the owner. And to be around Max and to be around the cars and to drive the car on the streets.
Although subsequent Old Yellers were improved, the competition was getting better and ever more sophisticated. Max always had the sheer horsepower, but other developments caught up to him and passed Old Yeller by.
Once he saw the Lotus 19s and they were extremely fast rear engine cars, he knew that the technology now has been ratcheted up, and he knew that front engine cars were going to have trouble in the future.
The state of the art had gone beyond what Max was willing or could afford to do.
After Old Yeller 2's heyday, Max continued to build and repair cars, but he turned to the movies for a big portion of his business, using contacts he had made at Hollywood Motors.
During this time, Max also did a lot of movie cars, very special vehicles they used in the movies, you know, like the Love Bug.
And I think the famous one was certainly Bullet and Steve McQueen, who later became a great friend of Max.
And I think they rented Old Yeller too, and Elvis Presley drove it in a really terrible movie.
The cars had to do some incredible stunts, and that was all because of Max carefully planned out how the geometry and suspension should be on those cars.
The feisty Old Yeller was a reflection of its creator, Max Balchowsky. Underneath their tough exteriors was something unpretentious, unassuming, and highly sophisticated. Both attracted many respectful admirers, including actor Buddy Hackett.
Hackett invited him to go to the White House. He had a show to do there. The only condition that Buddy laid on him was, you got to wear a suit. So he got a suit and he went with them. They're sitting around with the Prime Minister of Canada, Kissinger, and President Ford. And Ford walked up to him and said to him, he goes, "I hear you build a mean machine."
Today, Old Yeller 2 is a lasting tribute to Max and Ina, thanks to the dedication of vintage racing enthusiast and automotive historian Ernie Nagamatsu.
Dr. Nagamatsu has carried on with these cars.
He's fun to be around because you just can't help smiling the way he is so enthused about the car.
What he's done is to keep this image alive. I'm very proud of you, Ernie.
I used to live about 5 blocks above the Hollywood Motors famous legendary garage, and after I got to know Max, he and I would go out to late night coffee meetings, and he would spin out story after story about his racing in the Old Yeller race cars, and that's how I got intrigued and interested in his cars.
Old Yeller 2, the meanest junkyard dog of them all, will forever be a reminder of the tenacious spirit of Max Balchowsky.
I worked on Viva Las Vegas in, let me see, when the devil was it? June 1963 with Elvis Presley. And he was a good driver. I don't know why people think he can do anything. He was a good driver in the car, and he was interesting. He'd ask you, how's this car and what does it do? And he wanted to know some of the points on the automobile.
Max and Ina Balchowsky created a racing legend called Old Yeller 2. And although these amazing people aren't around today to see their car continue to bring joy to scores of loyal fans, it has raced every year since it was built.
Once I had a surprise birthday party for Max and Carol Shelby, and Pete Brock and everybody came, and he was overwhelmed because everybody for the first time gathered around and kind of said some funny and great stories about Max, but there was really a sincere respect for Max. And I know we were driving home, and Max shook his head and he said, "I just didn't believe that they had respect for me." And so here's a man that finished racing, made an impact, went on to movie cars and such, and yet all those years he wasn't sure.
He was a magnet for both young and old, amazed at what both he and Ina were able to accomplish with next to nothing.
I loved him. He was great.
Many fans come up to me and tell me stories, and very personal stories, but I think the one that I remember the most is when a fan came up to me several years ago and said, "I've got to tell you that things have changed, and I don't think we can ever go back to those days when Max and Ina were racing." And he said at Riverside, he was there at the Sports Car Grand Prix, and the Old Yeller 2 was racing. And he said at turn 6, every time the Old Yeller came by, everybody in the stand stood up and cheered. And it wasn't a matter of the Old Yeller leading the race, but they cheered because they had a hero.
They lived the American dream. They were inventive, resourceful, and they left their mark with a loud, fast car they built themselves by hand from the ground up. And during the golden years of sports car racing, they challenged the best the world could throw at them and won. To this day, the unmistakable bark of that junkyard dog still turns heads wherever it goes. Max and Ina Balchowsky and Old Yeller 2 will never be forgotten. We hope you've enjoyed this edition of Behind the Headlights. I'm Bob Varsha. Join us again in the future for the story of another extraordinary automobile.